And yeah, whenever you like, you're good.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Akash. I'm one of your TAs. Over the next 20 or so minutes, we're going to review the principles of good code design. We'll also be talking about standards and tools to help us write standardized idiomatic code, as Chad had mentioned earlier. Now, this subject could be an entire class, as there's an awful lot to be said. Even within the software development community, there is a lot of disagreement on what good code should look like, but we can, however, agree on some fundamentals. So look at these two samples of code, and what do you think is easier to read? I think most people would agree that the code on the left does look better than the code on the right. But why is that? What made one piece of code good and the other bad? Well, there's several things. The first thing is that you look at that code and you immediately feel intimidated. It's not readable. If you look at your own code a year from now and can't figure out what it does then, it's probably not readable. That code wasn't very maintainable, and that ties into readability and good design. How can others repair or build upon your code if it's hard to work with? The code wasn't consistent. It had random spacing all over the place, random semicolons, and it's not well documented. So what makes this bad code? You can ask yourself, what about this code makes it less readable or harder to develop upon? It has bad indentation. You'll struggle to find where you are. Even worse than just no indentation, this example has random indentation. You'll notice that our iterator is called dog. Does this variable represent a dog? Variables shouldn't be random. They should always mean something. The exception is when we use something like I in small scopes, we'll say for let I equals 1, where the purpose is obvious because I, j, and k is a standard, and I stands for iterator. And the inconsistency, there's so much inconsistency in here. If there's one thing you should take away, it's that readable code is consistent code. The name of our function has random uppercase letters in them. Why? This isn't a standard. It doesn't make it more readable. Also consider the spacing between here and here. Here we have a space in front of the modulus, here we don't. Here we have uneven amounts of equals, the use of semicolons where there shouldn't be, or in some places where they should be. It's all very inconsistent. So what makes this good code? We have a big comment at the top of the function specifying what the function does and what it returns. Also consider how we have comments throughout the code that explain what's going on. There's a sweet spot between not adding enough comments and over-commenting your code. Over time, you will get a feel for it. This code is consistent, and I can't say this enough times. Good code is consistent code. The spacing, use of semicolons, and quotations are consistent throughout the code. And it's standard. Here we conform to the standards that JavaScript developers around the world all use. For example, we indent with 2 spaces, and we annotate our functions in a specific format. This matters because it makes sharing, building upon, and developing code as a community much easier. So earlier we heard Chad talking about Pythonic code or idiomatic Python code. And that extends to beyond Python. It extends to all code. There are standards for languages. We use snake case with little underscores in Python, or camel case with capital letters in JavaScript. And we don't do this arbitrarily, because there are existing standards for languages. So many different people and organizations have different standards for the same programming languages, and they're accepted by the software development community at large. So here are a list of different standards for writing JavaScript, each with slightly different rules. Where should I put semicolons, or should I have them? They're all good because they're consistent in and of themselves. but you shouldn't mix and match standards within the same project. It turns out your IDE can check for syntax errors, find problems, and enforce any of these styles, and it does so using what's called a linter. So a linter is just a program that checks your code as you code it. It looks for inconsistencies and patterns and warns you against potential problems that contradict a code style. That doesn't mean all we learned about writing good code should be thrown out the window and we should all trust our linter. It's still just a program and can't write efficient and well-designed code for us. Even professional software developers will make mistakes, forget a semicolon, so on. So I figured I would briefly show you an example of using Eslint, which is a popular linter for JavaScript. But before I do that, I just wanted to show you some of the existing standards in a little more detail. For example, in Python, one of the more popular standards is called PEP8, and it will specify a lot of questions like, should I use tabs or spaces to indent my code? And it will say, you should use spaces. How many spaces should I use? It'll tell you you should use 4 spaces. Wow. You go to JavaScript, they'll tell you to use 2 spaces over here. They'll tell you about how you should export your code and how modules should be defined. So you can find the details of how a certain style is implemented just by looking it up, but your linter will automatically enforce that for you once you specify the style you would like to conform to. So over here, we have the 2 coding examples we mentioned earlier on Fizzbuzz. And Fizzbuzz is a very simple program that just takes numbers that are divisible by 3 and 5 and writes Fizzbuzz. If it's only divisible by 3, it will say fizz. Only divisible by 5, it will say buzz. And else it will just say the number. Now that's a lot harder to come across from here, but you'll notice how here I don't have any warnings or errors. But over here, if I were to write something like some bad code, I'll get a little red squiggly underneath, and that indicates that there's a warning or error. So I can hover over it, and it will say multiple spaces were found here. And that's coming from Eslint telling me that I can't do that. So if I correct for that, I still have one. It says, hey, you're missing a semicolon. So that's great. So how can I set up Eslint for my bad code? And then it will tell me what I've done wrong. So first, I'm going to change directory into my bad code. I'm going to start. Oh, my bad. I'm going to initialize a npm project. Go.
Hey, Akash, is there any way you could kind of increase the size of your font in your code window?
Absolutely. Is it difficult to see at all, or?
A little bit. I mean, if you can make it bigger, that'd be a little easier. Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, my screen is lagging a little bit from the stream, so. All right. All right. Once we have created our npm package, from here, we will be able to set up Eslint. And you do this by specifying Eslint initialize. And from here, it will give you a bunch of prompts and options for how you would like to use Eslint. So like we mentioned that it can check syntax, find problems, and enforce code style, you could say, I don't want to enforce a code style. I just want you to check for general syntax errors, like not using JavaScript properly. It will warn you. But let's say we do want to conform to a certain code style. So we're going to go with the last option. Here we use CommonJS, which is the standard we use here. We're not using any web frameworks, so we're just going to say none of these. We're writing with JavaScript. It runs on the computer. In the future, we're going to be using JavaScript for web development, and you'll find that Eslint is very helpful in that context as well. Now you can actually make your own style guides. So you don't have to do what Google does, but it's good if you have an idea of how you want your code to look like and you're consistent with it. And this is especially helpful if you have multiple people on your team, so you can all work together using the same style guide and your code will look consistent all the way throughout the project. So we're going to choose a popular style guide, and I like the one that Google uses. And you can actually look up how these are different in which ways online. You just look up the Airbnb style guide for JavaScript or click the links they have provided. So I'm going to go with Google. And the format that it's held in is pretty irrelevant, but I'm going to go with JSON. Now the Node Package Manager will install the dependencies and the information required for it to enforce the Google standard. And that'll just take a second. And those little warnings that we got from our good code should appear in our bad code. Oh, there they all are. Immediately it says you shouldn't use var, you should use let or const. A lot of things that we could fix. I could hover over here, use let or const. It doesn't like using var. In ES6, the new standard of JavaScript, we don't use var anymore. It seems to want you to repair your first issues first. Use let or const. Okay, so expected indentation of 2, but found 0. So all along here, it's flush with the left, but usually you do want to indent with 2 spaces, like we mentioned earlier. So I'm not going to go through the process of updating this because there's a lot to be changed, but I think examples of how it's outlined are pretty great. If you want to see a list of all of your problems in VS Code, you can just go down to the Problems tab, and it will outline every little thing that's wrong with your code and where you can find those problems in your code. All right, and that concludes what I had, my little presentation. If anyone has any, all right.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't ask questions directly, but
No
has anyone asked any questions in the chat that, let's see. Oh. Okay, so yeah, there's nothing right now. So yeah, thanks, Scott. That was really great. I appreciate it.